Here we are again at RSAC Conference 2025. It's Wednesday. It's the third day of the conference. So we're all a little punchy. We're all running on fumes. I'm highly caffeinated. I hope you are. We're here recording live from the Cyber Risk TV booth in Broadcast Alley, which is located in Moscone West. I'm co-host of Paul Security Weekly, Jeff Mann. Joining me this morning for a conversation is Joel Burleson-Davis. Joel, welcome.
Thank you.
Joel is CTO of a company called Imprivata. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into cybersecurity.
Yeah, so I started in cybersecurity. I grew up in Arizona, sort of a smaller town, and just technology was interesting to me. And way back when, like Windows NT, Novell NetWare sort of days, security wasn't a big thing.
Right.
And I found myself doing really interesting stuff that you weren't necessarily allowed to. Which was great.
I'm hearing hacker coming out.
That was good. That was really
okay.
Then you grow up, you go to college a little bit, and you enter the workforce and say, hey, what am I good at? What's interesting? What's fun? And I ended up actually just post-college moving to Australia.
Wow.
And one of the most interesting things is a big piece of their industry is industrials and mining. And those, from a technological perspective, those tend to be a little behind the rest of the curve, the modern curve. And so I remember showing up and getting a sort of just like a generic technology job because they didn't really differentiate that much. And, thinking of the massive amount of things that they did, mining iron ore, mining aluminum, mining uranium, all that stuff. And with pretty lax
Don't they
security.
also throw shrimps on the Barbie and drink a lot of beer?
Yeah, and that's delicious, and that's how that's how you spend your time afterwards. And so I ended up like really getting into security there because there needed to be so much maturity in the technology programs I was in, sort of working for these mining companies in Australia. And since then, I've 20 years ago, I've stayed in that, sort of stayed in security and continued going on, sort of seeing the need, across industries like, manufacturing or even healthcare or, mining industrials, the need to continue to mature those because the risk environment is the same for them really as it is for all of us. And so that, we have to make sure all of those critical industries level up just like, the rest of industries.
Right. So you came back to America at some point and found same problem here.
Yeah, same problem here.
There's a lag, especially in those industries.
Yep.
Why do you think it is, I have my theory, but why do you think it is that critical infrastructure tends to fall behind or lag behind?
Yeah, I think there's a few historical reasons for it. Like one, many, if you think of sort of industrials, particularly our manufacturing, like one is they were disconnected. They were not necessarily connected.
Right.
And so, if something happened at a site, like a power generation site, you had to roll a truck. Right. You had to have someone get out there, physically plug in.
But then, the internet.
Exactly.
and modems.
Yeah. And I think there was not a lot of appetite for investing in modernizing any of that equipment.
Right.
And so they, came up with like clever tools to plug in a D shell and then connect that to a LAN cable, and suddenly you have a connected device. Yeah. Security from 30 years ago.
I mean, I think it has a lot to do. I'm a little bit older. I grew up in the 1900s, and my parents grew up in the Great Depression, and I think largely was true of the industrial age. You built things to last.
Right.
You build a piece of equipment, you want it to last 20, 30 years.
Right.
Not so in our world.
Right.
We're expected to refresh everything in 12 to 18 months or something like that. And I still have a hard time with that. I had my last smartphone for like 7 years and it finally bricked.
Yep.
And I brought it in to get a new one. They're like, holy crap, how old is this thing? It was like a S4, and now I got a 24. So, but that's me. But I grew up with a mentality of you buy something and you make it last. You fix it if it's broken. You don't just throw it out and get a new one.
Yeah, and I think there's an element to that, right? Like if you have a super expensive machine that you spent millions and millions of dollars on, and you're like, you have to replace that entire thing. Still works, still does its actual function well, but is insecure from a cyber perspective. That's like a hard pill to swallow.
Well, and it's the conundrum of the internet age, because the internet wasn't designed for security. It was designed for speed and communication and convenience and connectivity.
Right.
And it's a whole lot easier now to connect remotely to your sites that are miles and miles away across a county or across a state.
Right.
And we haven't quite figured out how to make the connection. But so what is Imprivata doing to try to help make that type of scenario more secure?
Yeah. So we do a few things, but the mission at Imprivata for the most part is to ensure that access is simple and secure.
Okay.
And so there's this dynamic that we see, across most all industries, and particularly, these critical industries like manufacturing, like healthcare, where the risk environment is continually escalating, and so security teams are saying we have to introduce more security, more strict security, higher levels of security. And the first question they ask, which is the wrong question, I think, is how do we get our users to then adopt this new layer of security?
Right.
The first question they should ask is, do we need to burden our users with that? It's like, yes, we have to raise security, of course, because we don't want to have a ransomware attack. We don't want to get breached in some way. We don't want data exfiltration. But do we need to pass that security burden on to those end users?
Right.
And so my argument is hopefully the answer is no, right? That's the promise and magic of, software and technology and hardware, is that you can do increasingly more amazing things without, requiring burden on end users.
I think my first question would be, how many users even need access to the equipment? How many maintainers and administrators do you need?
Well, but even end users, if you think in, shift work end users in manufacturing, healthcare, they have shared workstations, they have shared mobile stations. They have operating technology, right? There's equipment on the
So
floor.
we're not just talking manufacturing.
Right. Yeah, we're talking about sort of generically access.
Okay. Well, and you brought up healthcare. You do a lot there. That's not critical infrastructure, but that's critical.
It's a critical industry.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And if you really think about the way that those, the folks operating there, they're very good at their jobs, but they're not necessarily technologists. They're connecting into a shared workstation.
Right.
They have a shared mobile device to do, maybe charting or something on. They're, connecting into MRI machines to run scans.
Sure.
And so you want to make sure all of those, devices and so that workflow stays streamlined and safe. But those users are going to scream if you say, every time you touch the MRI machine, you have to username and password. You also have to, catch a token, type something in,
right,
and go.
My day job's in the consulting world. I don't do the healthcare stuff directly, but I'm adjacent to it, and I know one of the big arguments is, person on the operating table is flatlining. We need instant access to his records to find out, what drug is going to bring him back to life, and you can't be like, well, I have to enter my 32-character password, but multi-factor authentication.
Yeah, exactly.
Meanwhile, flatline.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
I think we all get that intuitively.
Yes. Yeah. So, when you think about that, escalating risk environment, the fact that, more and more healthcare systems and manufacturing systems are being targeted by these really well-funded, mature,
not to nitpick, but are they targeted or are they just convenient targets of opportunity because they can be successful, the bad guys?
I think that's both.
Yeah.
I think it's it's very useful.
Semantic, probably.
Going back to the COVID dynamic and ransomware gangs attacking. There was a uptick in attacks at healthcare during COVID from ransomware, because that I think they're taking a cold, rational sort of business perspective of it. You take over a hospital during a pandemic, you're going to get paid fast. Right. So that becomes a lucrative target.
And I've heard that there used to be sort of a code of ethics that, let's not touch those things.
Which is gone, right? That
doesn't
exist anymore.
But now you've heard this before. Well, it's just business. It's nothing personal. We can make a lot of money here.
Yes.
So what if somebody dies?
So there's been that, right. So there has been that transition a little bit. So I do think that they're targeted because especially ransomware gangs, because the pain that you can inflict, and therefore sort of the how rapidly you can then get paid out for that attack is pretty quick, right? If you take out a regional healthcare system, they're going to need to get back to operation really quickly, or else that you're risking lives, right? And that's a really high cost to pay.
So talk a little bit about, you mentioned you're trying to provide secure access. access controls, especially privileged access
Yep.
controls, without burdening the user.
Yeah.
Flesh that out a little bit. How's that working?
So one of it is to just take a look back at the modalities and the workflows of how people are operating, and giving optionality to those workflows. And so if you go back to say that nurse case, nurse accessing a workstation, you need multi-factor authentication. Passwords are bad, right? Passwords are like one of the worst, slowest factors of authentication. But if they can tap a FIDO badge and have their face scanned and do a biometric,
Right.
and it takes about 1.5 seconds to log in in a secure way, that's like a win-win scenario.
Right.
It is way more secure and it's way faster. Right. And that's like one of our sort of a core example of how we make that easier and faster. And I think solutions like that is what people should continually look for when they get to that point. They're like, I need to mature my security program, I need to mature what I'm doing here. Is can you chase both like efficiency, simplicity, and the elevation of security?
Not to go off on a tangent, but I have geeked out on authentication more than one occasion. Years ago, it was right before COVID, I was in line at the airport and I'm standing in the TSA line looking at the clear line, and I'm thinking, okay, they're doing biometrics, I'm doing, which is one form of authentication.
Right.
I'm doing something I have, a boarding pass, an ID card. Of course, nowadays TSA is also doing the facial recognition. But I was like, okay, this is one form of authentication. That's another form of authentication. And traditionally, there was something that you have,
right.
something you know, something you are. And I thought, is one of the three inherently more secure than the other? So I did the research. Of course, none of this existed 25 years ago, because we weren't logging on to networks. But I learned that it was always from the very beginning understood that passwords were the weakest.
Yes.
But it was kind of all there was back then. And from the beginning, biometrics were acknowledged as the best. Well, actually, the three-letter agencies wanted to have some sort of cryptographic hardware device, key fob, something around, the RSA key for how many years did we have it? But biometric was always sort of the holy grail.
Right.
Now we're there.
Right.
Now we have it available.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and if you think about it, it's like you can always share your password. Right. If you have some sort of secret, something you can share that.
Yep.
And then you suddenly weaken that sort of factor of authentication.
You can share it. It can be intercepted.
If you have a badge, like a FIDO badge, you can share that. Right. And so then so that like fundamentally is weaker. It's really hard to share your face. Right, it's like really hard to share your fingerprints.
Mission Impossible movies might disagree with you.
Yeah, old school face-off movie, right?
Right.
Like, just go through surgery. And so I agree, and those are also much easier to use. But one of the interesting things I think that we've seen over the last 10 years is like facial biometrics were not well, sort of like not well adopted.
Right.
If you were to talk to, someone in manufacturing or even someone in healthcare, and you're like, hey, we're going to scan every nurse or doctor's face for authentication, they'd have said, whoa, we can't do that. There's privacy concerns. There's all sorts of concerns. Our population won't take that.
Right.
And then, comes the iPhone, comes Android, and like everything's facial authentication and Face ID, and people love that, and they use that in their daily lives. Clear, right? Like all these other things in our, common world, like the consumer world, show up using facial biometrics, and suddenly it's, much more well tolerated and adopted in those industries, just because the population got sort of used to them. But I do think they're a great avenue for sort of doing that passwordless journey of making sure that things stay secure,
right,
get simpler.
And it makes sense. And I guess to some degree what I'm hearing you say, and I think I would agree with it, that a full-blown biometric is as secure as multi-factor in certain scenarios where there's other factors like speed,
right,
and not just convenience, but we got to get this. Healthcare is just a no-brainer. So you guys are offering that. You're focused on balancing the risk of. You're describing it as the inconvenience, but I would describe it as the imperative. I got to get my job done. I can't be slowed down.
Yeah, there's multiple layers to that. So there's some, legacy apps and services that are always going to use passwords.
Right.
So we, one of the things that we do is we autofill those passwords, log you in. So it's like we make it feel passwordless because we can manage that.
So transparent to the user.
Fingerprint, facial, a badge of some sort, like a secure badge of some sort,
right?
And like continuing to look at different modalities, like how we can incorporate those, depending on the workflow, right? Depending on who's doing what, where are the cameras available, or are they not? Like, what is if we think that there's 6 to 8 modalities of authentication, how do we mix and match those to make the most efficient sort of workflow and use case for it?
Now, we talked a little bit about the different categories of critical infrastructure and the emphasis. Healthcare. There are healthcare regulations. There are security controls they need to meet. I don't know that that's necessarily the case for all the critical infrastructure that's out there, but I'm assuming that you guys work within the boundaries of the existing regulations to make sure that organizations are meeting the requirements, but in a way that you're not impeding the business operations.
And I think that's like I'm also a big fan of regulations as they make sense. Like, to me, they sort of start to raise the floor of an industry. You think like
let's cut to the chase. Most organizations are only going to do what they have to do,
right?
Because it costs money,
right? And you have to raise the floor. You have to do it in a mindful way. Sometimes regulations have let's say clauses that are asinine and they need to be removed,
right?
But often it sort of raises that floor for the entire industry,
right?
Like for the public sector, CGIS does a pretty good job of that, and they continue to sort of revise that. For power generation, there's NERC and FERC. For healthcare, there's HIPAA,
right?
There's a number of sort of regulatory initiatives that have helped sort of raise the floor on security, particularly these like critical industries that aren't necessarily technology industries,
right?
That without that nudge may or may not mature their security programs.
Gotcha. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. We've blown away because I want to keep talking. I didn't even get to the question I wanted to ask you, but. If you want to have more information about Imprivata, go to securityweekly.com/Imprivata, IMPRIVATA, RSAC. And for information about our broadcasting here at RSA Conference 2025, you can go to securityweekly.com/RSAC. Joel, thanks for our conversation this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We'll be back shortly with the next interview.